The movie starts with a beautiful morning at the New York Central Park. People are merrily enjoying themselves as fresh wind rustles the trees. Just like everyone else, two girls are sitting on a bench reading books. One of them, named Claire, starts to get confused about herself and her surroundings. Meanwhile, her friend looks around and observes abnormal behavior of people. Her restlessness rises as everyone in the park stops dead in their tracks, as if time has been stopped. The girl watches in utter distress as her friend Claire takes out her hair needle and plunges it down her throat and kills herself. The scene then shifts in downtown New York, where construction workers are joking around. Just as they are laughing, their cheeriness turns into dread as one of their co-workers plummets to the ground from high above. They reach him to find him paralyzed with dozens of broken bones and disfigured limbs. In the meantime, many other bodies start to drop down. The main leader of the construction site looks up, and to his utmost petrification, he witnesses the workers committing suicides by jumping off the buildings. Meanwhile, the movie flings us to Philadelphia, where a young teacher is teaching science to the students. He tries to engage them in a debate regarding the disappearance of honeybees from our planet, but he gets a minimal response. As he's trying to gather their interest, the activity is hindered by the entry of the vice principal. She asks Mr. Moore to accompany her, and they come into the auditorium to find it full with teachers. After all of them are gathered, the principal informs them about the incident in Central Park. He then states the dismissal of students and gives the statement that they should leave. As everyone leaves Mr. Moore's class, his friend Julian comes along and remarks how his mother is getting hysterical about their safety. After that, he tells him that she offered Moore and his wife, Alma, to come as well. Afterwards, the teacher named Elliot talks to his wife and states Julian's offer. As he cuts the call, he shares with Julian how Alma has been acting weird. In reply, Julian states that she might not have wanted to marry Elliot in the first place. The next scene shows us Alma sitting in her living room, extremely agitated. She jumps abruptly as her phone starts to ring, with the caller ID saying Joey. Just as she puts the phone away from her, Elliot arrives and they watch the news, where the anchor explains how the airborne toxins are disrupting normal human brain sensory cells and reversing them to cause fatality. After catching up on the dreadful aspects, Elliot goes into the room and packs up his bag. Meanwhile, Alma keeps getting calls from someone named Joey, which puts her in discomfort. Nevertheless, they make it to the train station, where Elliot meets with Julian and his daughter Jess. Elliot asks him about his wife Yvette, and Julian remarks that she'll take the next train. As they make their way down the hall, Alma greets Julian, but they share an awkward conversation moment. Due to the unpleasant encounter, Alma decides to sit separately and grabs her ticket. Elliot follows her lead and argues with Julian about being so insensitive. As their train leaves, the environment in Philadelphia also starts to change. The weather gets chilly, and slowly the same effect as New York starts to appear in the Rittenhouse Park in Philadelphia. People get paralyzed and gradually start to take their own lives on the street. Meanwhile, back in the train, everyone gets aware about the events in Rittenhouse Park. The people on the train start to panic as the frightful news starts coming in. Julian also tries to call his wife, but couldn't get a proper connection. After several tries, he gets a text from her stating that she's leaving for Princeton. This gives them partial relief, but that doesn't last long as the train makes a stop at the small town named Filbert. All the passengers get out. Meanwhile, the train drivers huddle at a corner. Elliot approaches them and inquires about the delay. After continuous urging, they confess the fact that they've lost contact from everybody and they cannot continue. Elliot returns with the news and informs his people. During the time, Jess gets extremely distressed and Elliot tries to reassure her that they are at a safe place. Afterwards, all of the passengers are now in a restaurant. Elliot sits with Jess and tries to lighten her mood by showing her a color-changing ring. She eventually laughs at his energy and dedication. Meanwhile, the news states that the attack is not a terrorist one, but rather a natural or biological phenomenon. As the anchor represents the affected cities, it dawns on the people that all of them are in the dead center of the toxic zone. Their state of terror goes up a notch as the place loses its electricity and phone connections. One of the persons gets up and urges everybody to leave at once or they'll die. At once, everybody leaves their seats and escapes outside. The people with the cars started giving lifts to the pedestrians and the parking lot got empty in no time. Like all the others, Elliot tries to hitch a ride but gets no luck. Just as they're looking around, an elderly couple offers them to come along. On the other hand, Julian arrives and tells them a car is going to Princeton and they have room for one. As Yvette also left for Princeton, Julian decides to go looking for her while leaving Jess in Alma's care. They bid goodbye and sit in their respective vehicles. Afterwards, they reach the elderly couple's house. They get out to grab their stuff while Elliot and Alma look around. They enter a greenhouse and the bearded man also follows them and states that it's the plants causing all the problems. As they start to leave the place, the scene shifts to Julian traveling towards Princeton. The Jeep casually travels along the road and reaches the Princeton area, but suddenly, they come across a huge tree laden with hanging human corpses. A girl starts to shriek madly upon the horrific sight, but Julian uses his senses and tries to distract her while asking to cover all the vents and openings in the car. Nevertheless, a small gash in the headliner of the vehicle still gets left open. As a result, the driver gets affected and crashes the Jeep into a tree. He gets thrown at a distance while Julian limps out. He staggers onto the road, sits down and starts cutting his own wrists. Meanwhile, Elliot and the others travel along a road and come to a stop as they see something up in the distance. The woman suspects them as dead animals, but when Elliot looks in the binoculars, horror strikes him as he sees human corpses scattered across a road. They immediately turn around their car and speed up the other way. Upon reaching a junction, they see a military vehicle and get hopeful, but the soldier, Private Oster, informs them that the place he's coming from is also infected. That leaves them with two alternate ways. And just as they're deciding what to do, vehicles starts coming from those roads as well. Upon inquiries, it gets known that those alternate ways are also affected and the people there are dying at a rapid rate. With no choice left to make and no path left to attain, they decide to stay in the midpoint. As the people get out of the car and huddle together, the bearded man comes up to Elliot and informs them that the woman is on call with her daughter in Princeton. Elliot runs up to her, and as she talks on the phone, unfortunately, her daughter starts behaving oddly, and it turns out that she is affected by the toxins as well, and she dies, leaving her mother in a poor state. Later, Elliot sits aside in isolation as Jess comes with Alma and leaves her to go up to Elliot. They both hug each other and cry. Afterwards, as Jess sleeps in the car, Alma converses with the elderly couple as they discuss how plants can communicate with each other and can be a probable cause for the spread. In the meantime, Elliot discusses the escape strategy with Private Oster. After reaching a conclusion, Private Oster addresses the people and a realtor comes with them to explain that they need to go someplace with a minimum population. He mentions a deserted town named Arundel and states that they should leave in two groups. After the division, they start to walk among the open fields towards Arundel. Private Oster's group had more people, meanwhile Elliot's group was small. As they tread along the wide open fields, Alma confesses to Elliot about her date with Joey, where she went out with him and had a dessert. It breaks his heart and he moves forward in grief and exasperation. On the other hand, the second group comes to a halt as the people on the front start arguing. In the meantime, a strong wind starts to blow and everyone watches in horror as the people go silent and Private Oster starts to stutter incoherent words. He gradually takes out his sidearm from the holster and a gunshot echoes through the fields. Elliot's group turns around and they get scared to death as multiple gunshots follow. Alma tries to go help the other group, but Elliot deduces that they should split into separate groups and plans in the winds attack specifically on more people together. Just as they're talking, the gusts of wind start to blow on their end as well, and they all split and make a run for it. The wind eventually surrounds them, but due to a lesser amount of people, nobody gets affected. After everything falls silent, Elliot looks around to find Alma and Jess totally fine, along with two other boys named Jared and Josh. As they move along, they see a truck parked in the fields. Elliot checks it out, but finds nothing. Instead, he notices a house in the distance and all of them walk towards it. As they enter, Elliot looks for a map, and after finding it in a drawer, he notices that they are 10 miles away from Arundel. Afterwards, Alma leaves with Jess to use the bathroom, while Elliot starts talking to a plastic planter. Noticing his stupidity, he leaves and comes to the living room, finding that everything here is fake and made out of plastic, with nothing to gather from the place. They leave the model house. Just as they reach across a road, a large group of people arrives at the house, but Elliot watches in bewilderment as a toxin engulfs them and a guy commits suicide by getting shredded from a lawnmower. After the horrific sight, Elliot leaves with his group, and they come across a radio hanging from the fence, but it doesn't work. They move on and come across a house in the distance. They decide to stay in it and look for safety, but as they knock on it, nobody opens the door. In the meantime, Josh and Jared send somebody inside. Elliot also peeks through the window and asks for food and help, but the man inside simply tells them to leave. Elliot keeps on requesting, but the man inside doesn't comply. In an unreasonable attempt, Josh bursts out and starts kicking the door. While Jared tries to rip off the window, Elliot orders them to stop, but they don't, and it eventually ends in tragedy as a shotgun nozzle slides through the door and both Josh and Jared get pierced with bullets. During this devastating incident, Jess is shaken to the core, while Elliot and Alma mourn over the death of the kids. After the tragedy, they decide to move on. Meanwhile, the news portrays the affected situation of the whole northeast side of the county, while everyone around many states listen to it. Out in the fields, Elliot and Alma come across an old raggedy house, and Elliot moves forward to check it out. He comes across an old lady sitting on the porch, and she invites them in for supper. As they sit on the table, they notice the oddities of that woman. As she's cut off from the whole world and isn't interested in knowing anything, she tells them about the tunnel underneath that goes to the room across the field. One can easily communicate over a large distance as if they're in the same room. Mentioning the oddness, at one point, she even hits Jess for reaching out for some food. After they finish, they go to their rooms and Alma puts Jess to sleep. As she discusses the weirdness of the woman, Elliot hears a sound outside and sees the woman standing in her nightgown, furious and suspicious about them stealing her stuff. Elliot tries to reassure her, but she simply leaves. The following morning, Elliot wakes up to find the house empty. He goes to another room looking for the old woman, but he finds a doll lying on the bed. Just in the meantime, the old hag appears before him and starts shouting at Elliot. Afterwards, she leaves the house and goes outside, where Elliot watches her go into a trance as the wind blows. He runs back inside and shuts all the doors and windows, but the woman appears outside and smashes all the windows with her head and dies. Meanwhile, Elliot listens to Jess's voice coming from a room, and he finds the room connected to the tunnel. Subsequently, Alma and Jess are in the opposite cabin across the field. Elliot warns them about the toxin and tells them to close the windows and doors immediately. Both of them sit across the floor and recall their happiest moments as they know that they are going to die anyway. Alma gets teared up after understanding how much Elliot means to her. Meanwhile, Elliot decides to come out to meet her instead of dying alone. The wind starts to blow heavily, and amidst the rustling leaves and fields, both make their way out. They close their eyes and walk through the blowing wind until they come together and hold each other's hand. After forming the emotional bond, they open up their eyes to the utmost astonishment as three of them are completely unaffected. Afterwards, they return to the cabin together and sit along the wall and conclude that it might have ended as they came to Arundel County. 3 months later, we come to see that everything is back to normal. Alma prepares Jess to leave for school, and Elliot sees her off at the bus stop. Inside, a reporter on the news states that all of this incident is a warning from nature as we are harming our environment. Meanwhile, Alma beams in happiness as her pregnancy test comes positive, and Elliot rejoices when she tells him. The scene shifts to a European country where two men are casually walking through a park. The people are busy with their on and about, when suddenly, a guy's friend starts getting confused and the movie comes to an end as the whole area attains the same situation as that of the USA.